Hello. So in today's video, we're going to basically be talking about why you should care about intercultural communication. See, I sometimes have students when they take the class think it's going to be a bunch of, foo-foo shishi, kumbaya, let's all hold hands and sing a song. But there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot more implications of intercultural communication than those simple things. Intercultural communication, particularly as we go forward as a species on this little planet we call Earth, has a lot of impact on your life, and your ability to do it well is going to affect several things. So, what those things are, what we call the implications of intercultural communication, are the subject of this video. So, as I stated, we're going to be talking about the 7 imperatives, the 7 real big reasons why intercultural communication is important to you, and why what you learn in this class isn't just theoretical. There's a very practical side to it. So let's start talking about these 7 imperatives. So what are they? Well, the first one is the peace imperative. Now, this shouldn't be that hard to understand, all right? At the time of my recording this, there's a couple of major conflicts going on in the world. And as we all know from history, these conflicts, they can escalate and then cause a lot of problems and a lot of death. It's just the way it is, okay? Any student of history can tell you that. So our ability to be able to successfully talk and negotiate our differences is a key thing in order to create peace, to understand cultural differences, how they affect things like perception and interpersonal interactions and values. Understanding this and understanding how to navigate it is an effective tool. It's an imperative tool, hence the name, to try and create peace in countries that are hostile to each other. So, in order for us to try to have a more peaceful society moving forward, I'm not going to say that we're going to fix the entire world. I mean, people are people. But in order to try to shoot for this goal and to solve these problems, we need to know what intercultural communication is, what to look for, and kind of how it functions and how to try to do it effectively, because we'll need that to try to solve these global conflicts and create areas of peace. Now, our next imperative is what you may call the economic imperative. Now, what this is talking about here is we are getting more and more within a globalized economy. All right. Don't actually do this, but metaphorically, if you were to go through your house right now and look at stuff that you own, you'd probably find several different countries, made by China, made by Vietnam, some made in the USA, others Canada and Europe. We are in a process of globalization where the countries are economically dependent upon each other, okay? And this is going into things like business. How many major companies can you think of that don't do business in at least 2 countries, their home country and some other country? Okay. So, in order to do this effectively, all right, in order to have these good trade negotiations, in order for you to be able to do business effectively in another country, you need to understand intercultural communication and have intercultural competence, all right? What I mean by intercultural competence, and probably should have said this earlier, is being able to understand what intercultural communication is and be able to apply some of the theories and techniques you see in this class to these situations. I mean, if you're Ford Motor Company and you want to start selling cars in this country you've never sold before, think of all the communication encounters you're going to need to have in order to make that happen. You're going to have to set up distribution lines. You're going to have to set up dealerships. You're going to have advertising. And that needs to relate and be digestible. Doesn't matter. Ford's in Detroit. It doesn't matter if this ad campaign worked in the United States. Will it work in this other country? Will it work in Madagascar or Australia or Thailand? And there's some great historical examples of ads that worked well in one country that totally bombed in another one. Okay. So because we are becoming more globalized, because companies do business across borders very often, and a lot of our economic prosperity, not only as an individual, but as a country, is based upon the effectiveness of these economic relations. That's why there's an economic imperative to understand intercultural communication and have intercultural competence. Now, our third one is very related to the second one, but a little different. That's the technological imperative. You may think of it as the technological imperative, the technology things we're going to be talking about have fed into the economic imperative. They've allowed the economic imperative to develop. And what the technological imperative basically is talking about is our modern technology, the internet, social media, things like that have really, for lack of a better way of putting it, shrunk the world. You can hop on Facebook, MySpace, if anybody still uses that, Twitter, Snapchat, and have conversations that fast with people in totally different parts of the globe. That was unheard of 20, 30 years ago. All right. Now, that has enabled some of the globalization to occur. It was going on ahead of time. I mean, you still had outsourcing, but it's a heck of a lot easier. I'll use my Ford example. It is a heck of a lot easier to keep tabs and check in with your Ford plant in Malaysia now with the internet and email and Zoom and all these different social media pages. It's a heck of a lot easier to manage and keep in contact with them than it was before all this, because before all that, all you had was long distance phone calls. And then you had to deal with time changes and stuff. So because we are becoming more interconnected, because technology has enabled that, we come into contact more frequently with people from different cultures. And as such, it is imperative to understand those differences to make the technology work. And this goes back to the peace imperative. If you're getting in touch with other cultures and you're not treating them nice, it's going to lead to problems and hence, bad stuff. So that's what I mean by the technological imperative. Technology, for all of its greatness, has made the world effectively smaller. We're not as isolated as we used to be. And so because of that, we need to understand and have a good competence of intercultural communication. And our fourth one is the environmental imperative. Now, I know you might be like, what does the environment have to do with intercultural communication? And that's a fair question. Okay, but here's the deal. As we continue to move forward as a global community, we're going to face just naturally more environmental disasters. We're going to have things like hurricanes and earthquakes and so forth. An earthquake does not care what country you're in. A hurricane doesn't come up to, oh, I'm going to hit the United States. Never mind, I'll shift. I like the US. Hurricanes don't do that. All right. So you can have these natural disasters that affect multiple countries. And that would enable, for example, the Red Cross or the United Nations or whatever humanitarian agency you want to think of, they'd have to work with relief efforts across multiple countries that are all in a state of disaster. And that's different, could be different languages, different cultural practices. And so the environment thrusts upon us through these environmental disasters and problems, cross-cultural issues that we're going to need to navigate in order to be effective. There's another side to this as well, and that deals with limited resources. Simple fact. As we move forward as a global community, some resources that now seem to be pretty much in abundance are going to become more rare, especially in areas where they now don't seem rare. Classic example in the United States is oil. Early mid-20th century, most of our oil came from the United States, areas Texas and Wyoming. Now the vast majority of it comes from other countries because we have to keep getting it, so we get it from there. And a big issue, for example, that your textbook discusses involving this scarcity of resources is fresh water. As we gain more and more of a global population, the need for more and more fresh water becomes a bigger and bigger thing. And I know you might be thinking, well, 3/4 of the world is covered in water. You can't drink salt water. It has to be cleaned. And so this is actually predicted by the UN and several other organizations to be one of the key conflict areas is water. Who's going to have water rights and who's going to have access to it, which is an environmental issue. So these issues of natural disasters and scarce resources are going to make us have to cross intercultural borders and guidelines. And so again, this is another reason why it's so imperative that we understand intercultural communication and are competent in its skills. Now we have the demographic imperative, our, I believe, fifth one. This one's pretty easy to understand. If you think about where you work or where you go to school, it's probably not all people that from the exact same race, exact same neighborhood, exact same culture. All right. You have people, we're becoming a more diverse global society, right? As people have more kids, as this goes back to technology. How many people do you know have gotten married that are different cultures, but they met online? It's one of the things that technology has done. It's allowed vastly expanded people's dating pool. It used to be a geographical limit to it. Now there's really not. So because we are becoming more diverse, not only in, biological sex, religion, race, ethnic, gender, all these things, this means we're working in a more dynamic intercultural environment. Our country's more diverse, workplaces are more diverse, schools more diverse. And this comes with then a need to be more interculturally competent to be able to compensate and navigate these intercultural differences. Okay. And don't always think by these, I mean, US versus like Cambodia. I had a friend of mine when I got my master's degree at the University of Wyoming, and I had a friend of mine who I met there who came from Michigan. She was in her PhD program there, and and she taught economics, and an example that she had used for years in Michigan to illustrate the moral link between companies and a community was plant closings. Is it moral for a company to close a plant if there's a town of people that plant is their entire reason for being there, and how that affects things? And you can see how that might be relevant to people in Michigan with the history of the auto industry. But she was telling the story in Wyoming, where the primary industries are gas and oil, which you might call energy, tourism, and agriculture. So the students there were like, if they have to close it, what's the big deal? They have to close. You just move. And she was like, no, you don't understand. And it basically was, yeah, they didn't, because this wasn't an example that related to their culture. So it's not just like England versus France. You have various cultures here in the United States. And as we become more diverse, being able to navigate these is going to be a more and more important skill. And this next one, our sixth one, is the self-awareness imperative. So what is this about? If I was to boil it down to its nuts and bolts, the self-awareness imperative for intercultural communication boils down to you being aware and understanding yourself better. What are, for example, the cultural influences that shape how you see the world, how you act, what you believe is right and wrong? Okay. You might not be aware of these. So looking at intercultural communication, becoming more competent in it, allows you to be more self-aware and understand these influences on your perception and your life that you may not have noticed before. Now, I want you to be clear. I didn't say they were bad. All right. You might discover an influence that you never thought about before, but are totally fine with that being an influence. You think it's a positive influence, and that's great. But the same can also be true as you discover you're thinking or viewing things a certain way because you're being influenced by a cultural idea that you don't agree with, but you just subconsciously never questioned it. So don't think of this as right or wrong. It's more so just being more aware of the influences culture is having on your individual perception, and therefore being more conscious of what you actually allow to influence you. I hope that makes sense. All right. But that's what the self-awareness imperative is about. And lastly, this leads us to, our ethical imperative. This is kind of a time bomb. All right. Not time bomb. Yeah. Ticking time bomb. This is a rough one. Okay. As we have more demographics, as these environmental issues cause us to have to do things across borders, as we try to have peace and technology and all these economical imperatives, this will inevitably bring with it questions of ethics. What is right and what is wrong? And I know it may seem, no-brainer, but there's very different ethical ideas of what's right and wrong in various countries. For example, there are currently in the world countries where arranged marriages are not only the norm, what's expected, but if I was your father and you were my daughter, the quality of the arranged marriage that I can get you is often viewed as a measure of how much I care. Like, do I kind of like put half effort into it, or do I really go full bore in getting you the best match I can? And that's viewed as ethical and the right thing to do. But for those of you born and raised in the United States, how many of you would be okay if you came home today and your parents are like, "You're getting married to this person you've never met in a month"? You'd be like, All right. So we have these different views of right and wrong. And it's not just about trying to navigate these. I think we can agree that if we could come to some consensus in general about these are some base level standards of right and wrong and things that are ethical versus unethical, that would help in a lot of other things, such as the peace imperative and those type of things. So we need to understand there's these ethical differences. Again, I'm not saying that automatically they're right and wrong, but they are different, and understand not only why they're there and the influences that created them, such as history, environment, whatever, but it also goes with being able to effectively talk with and potentially persuade people about changing an ethical viewpoint. If you don't understand why a society has this view of right and wrong and what went into creating that, then you're going to be incredibly challenged if you try to persuade them to change it. Because they're just going to be, no, you don't know anything about us, go away, and it's not going to work. So, in order to try to have a good understanding of ethics, to understand their differences, why they're there, and then potentially be able to negotiate it and come to a consensus, that is what the ethical imperative is all about. So, these seven imperatives, I hope you can see, are seven very practical and applicable ways in which intercultural communication and what you'll be learning about in this class impacts your life, and it will impact your future. This class may seem initially like it's just very theoretical, but there is some practical, very real things that the knowledge and the techniques and the principles and even theories that we're going to discuss, you can use them. They will be very applicable in the real world, and I hope you see that. That being said, I hope you got something out of the video, and I will see you in our next video. Have a good day.